speaking of other news, we have a closer look that we wanted to take this week, and it has to do with Microsoft and some of the fallout from CrowdStrike because they finally released an accountability notice after that whole outage that happened. And according to this particular release, which of course we have linked in the show notes, Microsoft is going to change and innovate in the area of end-to-end resilience. Now, how are they going to do that? Well, they've already started by introducing things like VBS enclaves, which require no kernel mode drivers, as well as Azure Attestation, which determines secure boot postures. If you read between the lines in the release that Microsoft put out, they see kernel access as their biggest issue, and they're going to try to develop new tools that eliminate the need for it, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, considering what we talked about last week and how they're blaming kernel mode drivers for what happened to the big outage that affected, now we know, way more than 8 million machines. So, Stephen, we talked at length about the outage, but I want to talk about Microsoft's response to it. They basically said that the way forward is to get things out of the kernel. What do you think about that?
Well, I think they're right. We're done here. No,
that's a show, folks.
I think that I think that they're right in that they have to get things out of the kernel. That's what other operating systems are increasingly doing. That's one reason that the CrowdStrike outage didn't affect Mac and Linux systems the same way. And I think that a similar outage would be less likely, but still possible on other operating systems. And as we discussed a few weeks ago with the whole was CrowdStrike really caused by the EU directives to Microsoft discussion? I don't think it really was. I think that's kind of a cop-out. CrowdStrike was responsible for this, and their poor QA was responsible. And the fact that they didn't test these things before rolling it out to millions of customers was a really bad decision. But what do we do going forward? Well, clearly Microsoft has a strategic path forward here, which is to move products like this into a virtual enclave within the operating system. The VBS enclaves leverage hypervisors, their Hyper-V hypervisor, and allows extensions like this to run in a hypervisor environment that can be more easily cleaned up and fixed in the event of an exploit, but also that will keep the core operating system from falling over if it falls over. This is a practical way forward, but let me say, I'd love to talk about this maybe a little bit later. The way that Apple is doing it is very different and actually probably superior as a long-term solution than just shunting this all into a hypervisor. So, but that being said, I do appreciate that Microsoft is trying to move this forward. What I don't really appreciate is that the rest of their note on best practices is basically motherhood and apple pie. It says you should have a business continuity plan, you should back up data, you should ensure that you can restore quickly. One of the things that they suggest is utilizing deployment rings, essentially to manage the rollout by slowing the roll of new software updates. Well, that's all well and good, but as we discussed with regard to CrowdStrike a few weeks ago or last week, you're trusting a service provider to do the right thing here. You actually need this rapid response. That's the whole point of CrowdStrike. You need rapid response and rapid updates to avoid exploits. I don't know that it really is the customer's responsibility to slow that roll if they're using a trusted partner. Now, I don't know if CrowdStrike should be your trusted partner given what they did here, but that being said, we all have to trust somebody eventually. I'm not going to be able to fly the plane myself, and so I have to trust that they're going to do their job right. And when they don't do it right, then I have to switch to a different provider, I suppose. Yeah, a lot of Microsoft's recommendations are good, but no, this isn't really the full solution that it should be.
I like your analogy here, Stephen, about I have to trust somebody to fly the plane eventually, because it underscores the point that people are trying to make about this. You may be amazing at Microsoft Flight Simulator. Doesn't mean you can fly a passenger jet. Do you have access to just walk up there and say, hey, I'd like to fly this jet today? You do not, in fact. In fact, if you try to make a move towards that cockpit door, you're going to find out exactly how much access you have as you are currently kissing the carpet in the aisleway. That is how Microsoft should treat the kernel in Microsoft Windows. Everybody is locked out of the kernel. If you want access into the kernel, you must have these specific privileges and you've been audited and stuff like that. And before everybody wags a finger, Microsoft should be subject to those same restrictions as well. The Microsoft kernel team should be in like a big ivory tower inside of Microsoft. Nobody gets in without permissions, and you don't get to slip little things in to make Microsoft Word run a little bit faster. And if you don't believe that that happened, I highly recommend you go read any Windows 3.1 book by Woody Leonhard, because they literally did that in the 90s. That's what almost got them broken up. In this notice, they talk a lot about zero trust. Zero trust works both ways. Just because the apps division needs slightly faster access to this memory location doesn't mean they should get it. Like, that's the whole reason that CrowdStrike failed, according to all the disassemblies that I've seen. It was bad programming on the part of people who were not sanitizing their programming environments. You cannot trust other developers to do the same things that you do. And if you want proof that Microsoft is not immune from this stuff, Azure went down this week for like 8 hours. And not only that, their DDoS protections amplified the problem. So these are a lot of interconnected systems that are working together, but one little problem takes the whole system down like a giant matchstick house of cards. The only way to combat this is to take the same page that, like you mentioned, Apple and Linux and other developers do, which is there are certain areas of the system which should be invalid. Nobody gets in ever. And if you want access, you work out of ring one and you have, calls into the system to do those things. That way, when a module crashes, doesn't take the whole system down. I mean, I look back at Ken Duda talking about this at Arista. Like, the reason why Arista systems were so resilient is because they don't let people into the operating system kernel like, at the time Cisco did. Cisco got smarter and decided not to do that. This is an ongoing problem. And I'll tell you why Microsoft has to have this. Because it's their legacy, right? Like, did you know that something like 88% of all crashes in Windows are actually caused by device drivers? Really? Because they have to support so much stupid hardware out there. And those device drivers have specific direct access needs. And that, honestly, is why your system has become more stable over time, is because Microsoft has slowly been injecting those drivers out of the kernel, or they have been putting that hardware out to pasture. I mean, Windows 10 and 11 are actually fairly strict on their hardware requirements for that reason. But this is a consumer operating system that we're seeing this in. Enterprise operating systems have tools like CrowdStrike that absolutely have to have kernel access. And Microsoft needs to start working with these companies to figure out how to prevent this, how to keep this from happening in the future. Because if they don't, the next one's not just going to take down a whole bunch of endpoint systems. It's going to take down everything.
Yeah, it's a real challenge for these operating systems. I don't underestimate the amount of work that Microsoft has to do here to remedy this situation. So just to kind of get back to it, as you mentioned, on x86 and ARM, there's different nomenclature, but essentially, let's say most privileged and least privileged. Some code runs in most privileged mode, right alongside the kernel, and some code runs in less privileged modes, all the way up to user space, where basically any user can run anything they want. Apple, I have to say, in Mac OS has really been doing the right thing in order to move things out of the kernel. They have been griping about kernel extensions for a long time. If you had a Mac back in the old days using the big cat named versions of Mac OS 10, you probably remember that you had to install kernel extensions for things like SCSI, audio, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, etc., and that those things were frequently not well supported, not well updated, and often caused your system to crash, and that sucked. Apple moved everybody away from that to what they call system extensions. These are non-privileged, and they use open APIs that are documented by Apple in the operating system. It has taken Apple a decade to roll this out, and they're still not done. even in the latest, greatest version of Mac OS, there are still, I think, 3 third-party kernel extensions that are allowed in the operating system for things like soft RAID, for example, that are really, really hard to abstract. But Apple has been abstracting them over time. They got networking out of there. They got USB, they got PCI Express, audio, Bluetooth, SCSI. All those things are pulled out of the kernel in operating release after operating system release over time. One of the key ones that they got out of the kernel was endpoint security. That's what we're talking about here. In fact, CrowdStrike Falcon, the software at issue here with the CrowdStrike bug, no longer runs as a kernel extension. It runs as a system extension on Mac OS and would not be able to crash the system because of the work that Apple did over that long of a time. The problem is that Microsoft is at the beginning of that path to some extent. Now, they've been trying to encourage people to get things out of the kernel, and that has been modestly successful. But the problem is they haven't put the hammer down like Apple did and said, no, guess what? No more endpoint security can run in the kernel, and I don't care if that breaks your product. And Microsoft has been always it's a bigger platform with a much bigger ecosystem, and they've always been willing to let people kind of ignore their guidelines in order to maintain backward compatibility. So Microsoft's move here in moving this stuff to a VBS, which is, as I said, a virtual environment that would have an API that would allow you to do things like endpoint security in a virtual container that would have to be signed and so on. I think that's a good practical way to maintain compatibility with this broad range of third-party software while also isolating it somewhat from the kernel. But it really isn't ultimately going to be the solution. Ultimately, they're going to have to do the same thing that Apple is doing, which is to say, no, we have APIs, and this is how you interact with the kernel. Now, one of the big questions here is, what about Microsoft itself? Would they be able to write things that run in, kernel privileged level? I will say that they really ought not to. It's really a bad idea to do that with your software. As Apple found out a few years ago when they accidentally released an update to Mac OS that managed to kill most Macs with an Ethernet port. They basically CrowdStriked themselves back in 2016 because they issued their own faulty kernel extension. They quickly fixed it, but it was a big hassle for people that were affected by it. And those kind of hassles are going to come anytime you're doing something that is inherently insecure, like running things in kernel mode. So I would say that what Microsoft needs is they need to take this moment seriously. They need to have basically a kernel mode czar within the company walking around and saying, no, 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 you can't do this. You saw what happened with CrowdStrike. We've got to stop doing this in order to make sure that the entire world is safe from another CrowdStrike happening.
And I'll leave you with this thought. If Microsoft gets all of their stuff out of the kernel and plays by the same rules as all the other third parties that they do business with, I bet you the EU would actually applaud them for that, because that's the whole reason why that ruling came down in the first place, is that having unfettered access to something that other people don't is kind of a monopoly situation. So maybe Microsoft will learn their lesson. I hope that we will see. And that as they do, we will definitely be covering it here on the Rundown.